So overall, we found that sleep onset difficulties were reported more often for infants who are at high risk and who later developed autism.
One takeaway is to appreciate the interrelationship between brain development, sleep, and outcomes like neurodevelopmental disorders.
That's Dr. Kate McDuffie and Dr. Annette Estes, who will talk about the research on sleep problems in infants who later develop autism. Their work appears in the June 2020 issue of the American Journal of Psychiatry. I'm Michael Roy, Executive Editor of the American Journal of Psychiatry, and this is AJP Audio. Dr. Kate McDuffie is affiliated with the Department of Speech and Hearing Sciences at the University of Washington in Seattle. She's a clinical psychologist and a postdoctoral research associate at the university's Autism Center. She is also a clinical bioethics fellow at the Truman Katz Center for Pediatric Bioethics. Dr. McDuffie is interested in how advances in neuroscience affect children and adults with neuropsychiatric disorders. Dr. Annette Estes also is affiliated with the University of Washington in Seattle, where she directs the university's Autism Center. She holds the Susan and Richard Fate Endowed Chair, is a research professor in the Department of Speech and Hearing Sciences, and is an adjunct research professor in the Department of Psychology. Her work is focused on understanding development in young children who show signs of autism and on how intervention and the family can support positive outcomes for children with neurodevelopmental disabilities. Dr. McDuffie and Dr. Estes are co-authors of an article in our June issue entitled Sleep Onset Problems and Subcortical Development in Infants Later Diagnosed with Autism Spectrum Disorder. Dr. McDuffie, Dr. Estes, hello and welcome to the podcast.
Hi there, nice to be here.
Hello.
Now, your article begins by noting the importance of sleep during the earliest parts of the life of an infant. The brain in particular is thought to rely on sleep to carry out important developmental activities. So first, could you talk about why sleep is so important during early life?
Sure. So infants spend most of their time asleep, and we assume that sleep serves a critical function during these early years of life. It's true across species that the very young sleep more than mature organisms. And the other important fact is that infancy is a time of incredible brain growth and very dynamic changes in the brain. Sleep's believed to be necessary for brain development to proceed normally. So, for example, animal models have suggested that the development of the visual system relies on sleep. And when you look at how infants are actually sleeping in the first year of life, you see newborns having the highest amount of sleep with a subsequent reduction of total sleep time across their first years of life. Also, there's a progressive consolidation of sleep patterns and a shift from sleeping equally during the day and night to sleeping predominantly at night. So this movement towards more adult-like sleep patterns is a major developmental achievement in these first years.
Now, it seems obvious that sleep has a key role in how much a child may be at risk for developing any number of problems. In terms of mental health, how can sleep affect a child's behavioral or mental development, as well as overall functioning in general?
Yes, we know that if sleep is disrupted in children, there are negative effects on health and behavior and cognition. In terms of behavioral and mental health, research shows that there's a detrimental effect of sleep problems across a very wide range of functioning. So everything from inattention, increased aggression, anxiety and mood problems, to executive functioning or impulse control problems. And with regard to autism, autism symptom severity is increased in the presence of sleep problems, including increased repetitive behaviors. And when it comes to thinking about this in infancy, there's a thought that early sleep disruptions might have a long-term effect because infancy is such a critical time for brain development, but really more longitudinal research is needed before we can know this for sure.
Okay, so now that we have some background information, let's turn to your research. Your article aimed to study the effect of poor sleep on brain development among children who are at high risk and at low risk for autism spectrum disorder. Why did you decide to study this phenomenon?
Well, sleep problems are 2 to 3 times more frequent in children with autism than children with typical development. And our early intervention work with very young children with autism showed us that the role of sleep problems was really important in the lives of families of children with autism. And it even could be a possible reason that some children with autism make slower developmental progress and suffer from more challenging behaviors than other children. So it's really clear that sleep problems correlate with the clinical severity of autism syndromes, but it's not clear whether sleep problems precede the emergence of autism or are part and parcel of the autistic syndrome. So the reason we're really excited to study sleep in this particular cohort has to do with the research design. It's called the infant sibling research design, and it's the design of the infant brain imaging study, as well as a number of other studies across North America and the UK. Children with older siblings with autism are 20 to 30% higher risk for developing autism themselves. So this high risk group is really important to study for clinical reasons. It also provides an opportunity to recruit babies who haven't developed autism yet. And this allows us to study development over time. In our case, this provided a window into the question of how early sleep problems might emerge in infants at high risk, and also how early sleep could be related to the onset of autism.
Okay, well, let's get into a little more detail about the research design that you mentioned. How did you go about conducting your research, and were there certain regions of the brain that were of particular interest?
So as Annette mentioned, this cohort of infants is from the Infant Brain Imaging Study, or IBIS. And in this study, we recruit infants who are considered to be at high familial risk for autism because they have an older sibling with autism. Then we compare them to low-risk infants who have an older sibling who's typically developing, and the low-risk infants have no family history of autism and first-degree relatives. So we then follow these two groups of infants, those at low and high risk, in longitudinal brain and behavioral assessments throughout early development. So these happen at 6 months, 12 months, and 24 months, and include behavioral assessments of cognitive development, as well as MRI scans, which are conducted when the infants are asleep. We have a really heroic team of MRI researchers across our sites that work late into the night, coaching parents and waiting for the infants to fall deeply enough asleep that they can start the scan. So this protocol, as you can imagine, following these infants at these multiple time points across development generates a large amount of longitudinal brain and behavior data. So for this paper, we chose to focus our analyses on 6 subcortical structures. So specifically the hippocampus, the amygdala, the caudate, globus pallidus, putamen, and thalamus. And the reason why we chose these areas is because each of them have been shown to show altered volume in autism, and they've also been shown in separate studies to be associated with sleep problems. However, there are no previous studies that have looked at altered brain development in autism related to sleep. And so this was really a first step in that area. We figured that these structures, because they've been associated with autism and with sleep separately in the prior literature, were a good starting point, but we definitely feel that other areas should be explored in further research.
Again, I want to give more of a sense of the size of your study, because your article used data on more than 400 infants from 4 different clinical sites. Can you talk about what methods you used to analyze the data?
Sure. Well, I can start by saying that one of the really unique aspects of the infant brain imaging study is that we use standardized protocols across all the sites. So from the beginning, these 4 sites knew we were going to be sharing data, and we had the same scanner platforms, imaging sequences, QC pipelines, and similarly for the behavioral data, that was kind of pre-planned to have standardized sort of reliability and measured.
Right, so we were really lucky to be able to build on this existing network collaboration that has all these standardized protocols across sites, and again, generates a really rich amount of longitudinal data. So our paper really is a secondary analysis of existing data that was generated through the IBIS network. It's important to note that the IBIS study was not originally designed to study sleep in infancy. However, one of the measures that we did collect was the Infant Behavior Questionnaire, which is a measure of infant temperament. And it contains a few items that ask about sleep, specifically about sleep onset difficulties. So an example question would be asking parents, how often did your baby have a hard time settling down to sleep, for example? So we took 5 items from the Infant Behavior Questionnaire and created our own, what we called the Infant Sleep Onset Problem Score. We were then able to validate this score that we developed in a subset of our sample against another measure, which is a previously used measure in the literature called the Brief Infant Sleep Questionnaire. Thankfully, we found that scores on our measure and the Brief Infant Sleep Questionnaire measure were highly correlated. So this really increased our confidence that the sleep score we were using was actually measuring what we thought it was measuring. So we were then able to look at relationships between sleep scores and trajectories of brain volumes in each of the 6 subcortical structures that I mentioned before, from 6 to 24 months. We did this using linear mixed effects models. And we were particularly interested to see whether the sleep-brain relationships differed across our 3 outcome groups. So that, again, were infants at high risk who developed autism and infants at high risk or low risk who did not develop autism.
Okay, I think we've done well setting the stage. So let's get to the results of your work. What were some of your main findings?
So overall, we found that sleep onset difficulties were reported more often for infants who are at high risk and who later developed autism. Scores on our measure of the sleep onset difficulties in infancy were negatively correlated with social communication scores by 24 months. So this suggests that infants who had worse sleep during infancy showed weaker social communication skills later in development. So then turning to the brain data, we found that infant sleep problems were associated with altered hippocampal volumes from 6 to 24 months, but this was only for that group of high-risk infants who went on to develop autism. We didn't find a relationship between sleep and hippocampal volumes for infants who didn't develop autism. We also found no relationship between sleep and volumes of the other subcortical structures. So this suggested that the relationship we found is specific to the hippocampus. Finally, we also ran a number of additional control analyses and were able to show that the relationship with hippocampal volumes was unique to the sleep items from the infant behavior questionnaire. So it wasn't an artifact of some other broader aspect of infant temperament. We also found that it persisted within each hemisphere separately, and it persisted when controlling for later cognitive ability.
Okay, and now earlier you mentioned the particular areas of the brain that you examined in this study. And did any of your results align with previous research? And did any results differ from previous research?
So as I mentioned, there's no previous work on infant sleep and brain development in autism. And there's also very limited work on sleep and brain relationships in typically developing populations. So we didn't have a whole lot to go on in terms of forming hypotheses for our study. However, when you look at the literature, we do see that altered hippocampal volumes have been associated with sleep problems in some prior work. This is work with rodents, with adults, and with typically developing children. Again, a few studies have shown that. However, what's really interesting is that these other studies found that sleep deprivation or reduced sleep was associated with smaller hippocampal volumes. Whereas in our study, we found that infants who had greater trouble falling asleep had larger hippocampal volumes. So while we didn't necessarily expect to find the relationship in this direction, it is consistent with what we're seeing in early brain development in autism in general, which is a dynamic pattern of brain overgrowth. So this appears to affect some structures but not others and can differ at different points in development. So I think what's interesting is this pattern of results that we and others have found in this body of work that's really growing highlights the importance of studying these developmental processes longitudinally, because you can learn so much more from following the same infant over time rather than a cross-sectional study which just captures a single moment in development.
So obviously there's a link between what happens during sleep and what you observed in your study. Could you talk about some of the neurobiological mechanisms that may underlie your results?
Sure. So as we talked about, this was secondary analysis of data from an observational neuroimaging study. So it really wasn't designed to uncover mechanism. And there's really not much we can say beyond that we've observed these associations. They don't tell us anything about causality. However, based on our findings and our reading of the literature, we can extrapolate and make some suggestions of potential mechanisms, which we think would be good targets to explore in further research. So for example, in non-autism research, the hippocampus appears to be a region of the brain that's particularly sensitive to the effects of disturbed or inadequate sleep. And that's across disorders as well as typical development. We also know that sleep deprivation can increase neuroinflammation, which can affect synaptic plasticity in the hippocampus. There's some work that's shown that inflammatory responses associated with sleep disturbance have been shown to selectively impact the hippocampus and impair performance on a hippocampally dependent learning task in rodents. So whether the same processes occur in the human brain are not yet known. However, I think autism is a really interesting context in which to look at some of these potential mechanisms because there have been some links between neuroinflammation and the pathogenesis of autism. So we definitely feel that this is an area that should be explored in further research that, again, is designed explicitly to be able to study some of these mechanisms.
I mean, there are definitely some intriguing findings that you've put out there. I should say, were there any limitations that may have affected your findings?
Yeah, so I think an important thing to note is that our measure of sleep wasn't objective. Rather, it was based on parent report. So this was a questionnaire that was asking parents to report about their experience of their child's sleep. So it will be really important to replicate these findings using tools for measuring sleep patterns directly in infants, tools such as actigraphy or polysomnography. It's also important to note that the 5 items that we included in our sleep score only capture information relevant to sleep onset difficulties, so trouble falling asleep either at night or from naps in the middle of the night, things like that. There are many other aspects of sleep that could be disrupted, and so we think that these results should be replicated looking at a broader, more comprehensive measure of different types of sleep issues. Finally, it would be ideal to have longitudinal data on sleep across a longer time span. So to be able to see whether these types of sleep disruptions that we see in infancy persist into childhood and maybe even lead to the development of a full-blown sleep disorder in childhood. It will also be really interesting to see whether patterns of brain development continue to diverge for children with sleep problems over development. And then, as I mentioned, I think we have interest in looking to see whether our findings of the sleep-brain relationship extend to other brain areas, so especially measures of cortical surface area, which our network has shown tends to be expanded in infants at high risk who go on to develop autism. So there's a lot of future directions. And again, we feel like this is an intriguing first step, but there's much more work to be done.
Okay, I'm going to ask you for a takeaway message here. I would say, so overall, what are the conclusions that researchers, clinicians, and other mental health professionals can take away from your work?
Well, one takeaway is to appreciate the interrelationship between brain development, sleep, and outcomes like neurodevelopmental disorders. It's a complicated story potentially, but I think one that's worth understanding. The other thing is that I think there's a tendency to make a leap from findings like this to clinical application. And we want to caution that this is really the first step in a process like that. So we found really quite subtle differences between groups in terms of sleep onset problems. And it's unclear whether at the age of 6 and 12 months, sleep onset problems are really a behavioral risk marker. If any of you have lived with a baby before, you would know that every baby presents challenges when it comes to sleep. And I think disentangling that from something that's more of a biological marker is a challenge.
And you've touched upon this, but I want to encourage you to take a little higher level view of this area and give recommendations you have for further research in this area.
Mm-hmm. Well, it will be important to look at early development and developmental processes to understand later outcomes. So sleep research tends to be cross-sectional. It tends to focus on adults or older children, and I think a developmental perspective is critical. Also, in autism research, the impact of sleep problems on intervention outcomes and developmental outcomes is probably underappreciated at this point. There could be also subtypes of sleep problems in autism, some that are more biologically driven, some that are more environmentally driven. And we really need to understand the implications of these different subtypes of sleep problems for intervention, for the timing and type of intervention that children might benefit from. So, really, I think future research should be aiming to make sure that parents have the skills that they need to help kids sleep well. There's just a lot of information that parents need to support healthy sleep in typically developing infants as well as children at risk for autism. And with children at risk for autism, it might be even more complex. And so I think, researchers need to be looking for novel treatments for both biologically and environmentally based sleep problems.
Dr. Kate McDuffie and Dr. Annette Estes, co-authors of an article in our June issue on how sleep problems may be involved in the development of autism in young children. Thank you both for speaking with us.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
This concludes this episode of AJP Audio. You can rate and review the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to it. Please also visit our website, ajp.psychiatryonline.org, to check out trending articles, find CME courses, and watch videos highlighting some of our other articles. APA Publishing has other podcasts you can listen to. Psychiatry Unbound is the books podcast from APA Publishing. It's hosted by Dr. Laura Roberts, editor-in-chief of APA Books. Also check out From Pages to Practice, which reviews the latest research published in the journal Psychiatric Services. It's hosted by Dr. Lisa Dixon, editor-in-chief of the journal, along with Dr. Josh Beresin. You can subscribe to these podcasts on Apple, Google, Spotify, or on any of the popular platforms. Next month in AJP Audio, we'll talk with Dr. Alexandre Dumais of the University of Montreal about his research on the extent to which the use of cannabis is linked to the risk of perpetrating physical violence in youth. We hope you'll join us too. Thank you for listening.